because I'm gonna go
Okay,
later on,
so
and I'm sure
sure.
others would like to see it.
Sure. So recording started. So for the recording purposes, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Kyle. On all social media, I'm Holy Macaroni. I'm also running my project under the name of EpochSec. You can find all of my information on my Holy Macaroni Twitter page. You can go to epochsec.io. You could go to EpochSec on YouTube. However you want to reach out to me, you can email me at kyle@epochsec.io, whatever you want. But that's my little short introduction. So what we were talking about before I started recording is I'm going to go into some general security practices, but first I want to talk about a recent incident with a project out there called Mutant. Jenny, is that Mutant Apes or Ape Mutant or?
Yeah, I'm not sure. And if mutants, I don't know. I'm
It's
sorry.
Mutants. Yeah, Mutants is probably close enough.
Something mutants, yes.
So what happened was they communicated that they had an issue and there was a bad actor taking, I believe, some of their rewards, right? And what they initially thought was there was a Franken address situation going on. Franken addresses by nature are not malicious, but just like many other things out there in our digital world can be used for malicious activity. Basically, that's taking a payment key and a staking key and from another wallet and putting them together, right? So I'm not going to go into Franken addresses too deep, but that's kind of the 5-second overview. But there are a lot of people all over the Cardano community that have put a lot of stuff out there. Homer has a good article out there. Sebastian from DC Spark put out some good information. I think Vegas from Vegas Pool from Hosky, he put out some good information. But go check that out if you want to understand Franken addresses more. But so they initially thought it was a Franken address. So the first issue I want to mention is, I guess a Franken address is the first issue. The second issue is what they did as a team. So if you ever have a project or anything, be cautious and correct with your communication. So that comes from a lot of experience I've had in forensics incidents, right? So I've worked with a lot of enterprise companies that have been compromised by a slew of things plus ransomware, right? Everybody's familiar with that term. I could mention Mimikatz, Cobalt Strike, things like that, but you're probably not familiar with that. That's really around credential data harvesting and things like that. Anyway, so that's kind of the background of where my thought process comes from. So the first thing I never do is say, I know definitively this is what happened until I know definitively what has happened. For one, you can cause people to be misled and take actions that are unnecessary or maybe detrimental to them. You can, you can even be held not that Mutant would be, right? But in theory, you could even be held legally liable for that, especially if you're not part of the team and you're communicating something that is inaccurate, right? That could be a legal liability. But more importantly, you're not being correct in your information and assuming that you know exactly what happened. So the reason I mentioned that was because then later on, I don't know the exact timeline, it was a couple hours or something like that. They came out and, I saw tweets from people saying, hey, here's another Franken address problem, and people getting all rowdied up about that. Then the project came out and stated that they had an API security issue, or an API security flaw, API security compromise, right? So those are the three main things to mention about that. One is the communication. Ensure don't wait too long to communicate, right? You can update people, but if you don't know the exact answer, you're not 100% sure about it, then don't say that thing, right? Maybe you can say it's possibly this, we're still digging into it, but I personally, I'm very careful about that. Not to hide anything, right? But I don't want to mislead anybody or put out false information until I know for sure what's happened. So the Franken address, like I said, that's taking a payment key and a stake key from different wallets, putting them together, and you create a new address, right? Now, an API security, again, Lee, Joyola, Jenny, I'm not sure of your technical level here, but APIs are essentially ways to interact with an application, right, through a string, if you will, a command, something that, it tells it you can take an action. So like when I work in security a lot, that's what I do. We have API keys to where I can say, I could, from a remote system, I can use an API key that says something about pull this object, right? Which might be threat event logs. So go to this server, go to this system, go to this remote thing, and pull down that information. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear my dogs, but they're barking. Anyway, so that's kind of, in a very layman's way of putting it, that's what an API is for. So that like a lot of the marketplaces out there, so JPEG Store and CNFT tools, they'll have APIs so they can pull information from each other. What you don't want to happen, and I don't know how Mutant has their API set up. I don't know anything about their API at all. I'm just speaking in general about the issues that a project could have if they don't manage their API security correctly. One is something called validation input, right? So if you put out a list of 10 different functions out there that people can do to get information from your site, or certain different information from your site using different API keys, you should only be allowing them to use something called GET, right? So if you go to a website URL, google.com, it's really a GET request, right? You're just trying to get the information. Simple as that. Now there's another function called, there are other functions, but the other main one I'll mention is post, right? So I'm posting something. So that could be another API command where I say, I want to put something there on that remote application, a remote server, or that remote thing. For one, you should never allow consumers ever to do posting, right? I guess that's not true. There are certain circumstances, especially in my field, where you want to allow that. But generally speaking, that's not a thing you should be doing in practicing API security. You should really mainly just be allowing them to use GET requests in APIs. The other thing, like I said, is validation input. So if someone is using an API and they're inputting some information, you want to verify that information is what you're expecting to see. So if I'm looking for a username and password, but they put in a SQL string, well, I shouldn't be expecting that in that field, right? So you should be doing validation input checking and then error handling, right? So in all coding, there's always this error handling thing to verify a lot of these. So if you're ever asking for input from whatever is using an application, there's always error handling for that thing, right? So however Mutant is handling their API, like I said, I have no idea. But generally speaking, those are the things you'll look at for APIs. There's a lot of other things, but I don't think I'm talking to Andrew Westberg, Sebastian type of people. So maybe I'll just not get any more in depth in API security right now. If you want to talk about more, if you want to talk more about that, you can just let me know, and I can show you some coding examples and things like that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So my question is, you mentioned that it is for a decent security, practice. You shouldn't allow users to use the post command. Is it command or function?
You could call it a function.
Yeah, okay. Let's say the post function. But are there instances where users would need to post something on that platform?
Yes. Yeah, and 1 second here. Yeah. Yeah. So first of all, so API means application programming interface, right? It's a way to interface with the application, right? You could call it a function, whatever, it's all really the same. But yeah, to your point, there are plenty of circumstances where that might be needed. So in my field specifically, if we have a security appliance or application that we are hosting in quote unquote the cloud, which the cloud is a very annoying term to me for one, right? It's not the cloud, it's just somebody else holding the information on their computers versus yours, right? Simply
Yeah,
put,
yeah.
right?
I know
yeah.
that. Yeah.
So if I want to allow them, but I want to control what they're allowed to do. I don't want to make. You want to be very careful when you create API post options, right? Because what you want to do is I might want to allow them to input a bunch of list of computers into that security appliance where they're going to push a bunch of security software to, right? If they're going to put antivirus on 500 computers, maybe they want to import a list of those systems into that remote appliance that we're hosting for them so they could push that software, right? So that might be an example. So yes, to your point, absolutely. There are definitely cases, but then at that point, you have to be even more careful with user input validation, error handling, and that kind of thing, because now you're allowing them to actually, push information right to the application. So, you really got to know what you're doing there and be very careful, right? But yes, to answer your question very simply, yes. Yeah. Did you have any other follow-up questions on that?
I had one, but it just skipped over my mind. But when I remember, I'll let you know.
Okay, yeah, no problem. But yeah, and there's a lot of other things you could do for let's see, I wrote a list because when I start talking, it's always hard for me to remember. Yeah, there's different authentication methods too for API as well, right? Using API keys, right? That's a very common thing to use. So I have a key, I have a public key, they have a private key. I use that public key to authenticate, right? Or I have a private key, they have my public key. Backwards, right? But anyway, I'm using that private and public keys to authenticate instead of maybe using a password, right? Because passwords are innately flawed, right? Regardless of what you do with your password, it's a flawed method for authenticating. So people use something called API keys. You can use OAuth, which I'm not really going to dig into that. But you can do things like that. You can use two-factor authentication, different things to ensure that the person using that API should be using that API, right? But yeah, two-factor authentication, I mentioned that. There's encryption methods you can use with APIs as well. And then you can use zero trust, and there's a lot of different, and then there's rate limiting too, right? So if you have an open API or I have access to your API, then I can essentially DDoS it. If you're not familiar with what I know, everybody kind of understands DOS and DDoS, right? A distributed denial of service. But what that's saying is, distributed denial of service is really like a bunch of different hosts or computers or at points of access, all sending information to that one application or site at the exact same time. And then there's a lot of DDoS protection things out there, tools out there, free and paid for, all that. But then there's a thing called rate limiting too, right? So in a lot of applications, you can rate limit how much API traffic can be consumed, right? So anyway, like I've said a couple of times now, I kind of get long-winded here. Just to summarize, if APIs are very common, pretty much every application has them. But it's API security is often a neglected thing, right? And I'm not saying Mutant did that. I don't know. Honestly, I don't. But if they did have an API security issue, then there's something they could be doing better, right? But yeah, so I would just be, there as a user, there's not a lot you can do if you're not familiar with API. You can look up what they're doing for API and things like that. But if you don't know how API works, then that may not help you. But what I'd be careful about is interacting with websites. If you can, if there's a website where you can put all of your NFTs on to stake them for rewards, I'd be very cautious about putting them all on there, right? So yeah, I mean, and the thing is, there's also non-custodial ways of doing that too. There are projects out there where they're custodial, where you actually have to lock your NFTs up. They're, they have them, and there could be issues with that, right? But then there's non-custodial too, where just like when you're getting ADA rewards every 5 days for staking your ADA to a stake pool, right? That's non-custodial. Or self-custodial, I guess you can call it too, right? You're in custody of your ADA and you get rewards every 5 days, right? So there are things you could do without knowing anything about that project. There's a lot of tools out there to help you though. There's a Twitter account called SecurityBot NFT. They were actually reporting on the Mutant thing. Then there's ScatDAO. They do very in-depth research on projects. Zerberus, starts with the X. They do kind of a rating thing. There's a lot of community projects out there to help you, right? So you don't have to rely on your own knowledge necessarily, right? Because you don't know what you don't know, right? Anyway, I'll move on from that unless there's any other questions. With Snap Brilliant and then Drip Drops are doing their breakout sessions, so I assumed I wouldn't have many people in here. But that's okay. I'd rather be in one of those too. So now, generally speaking, so I want to get back to a point I made about the concept of having your mind focused on a Web3 world, right? So there's and I do it a lot too, but it's common for us in the crypto world to get focused and assuming, maybe subconsciously, right, that we are strictly in this Web3 dimension, right? Where when we're interacting with our wallet, or we're interacting with the DEX, that's all Web3. You're fully secured by blockchain security and encryption methods and all of that. But it's important to keep in mind that pretty much 90%, if not 95 or 98% of what you're doing is still traditional internet things, right? And not picking on anybody, right? But MinSwap DEX, or the MinSwap DEX, Sunday Swap, the Claymates, whatever, right? The DGED website coming out, any of, they're still websites, right? They're still using the traditional programming languages, Python, Java, JavaScript, Node.js, Nest.js. They're still using all of these things, right? And you're still, a lot of them, sometimes they require accounts, right? So you're still signing up with a username and password for your email. You're still susceptible to, or those applications at least are always still susceptible to all of the traditional API attacks out there, SQL injections, you name it, right? So all of these are still, so it's still, you might have, your wallet might be fine and your assets on the blockchain might be okay, but you're not okay, and therefore your assets may not be okay too, because what if you're on a website and you get compromised and they get something on your system, then they gain access to your system, and what if your password for your wallet is really insecure, or you're saving your seed phrase on your computer, or doing anything that bad actor now has access to in your system, right? Or going to a malicious website, site website hijacking, creating, Midnight had that happen to them, right? Where somebody created a fake Midnight Twitter account and then created a fake Midnight website claiming that you can now go get your dust. It just, you send some ADA and then you'll get dust. When the dust token isn't released, that wasn't the official Midnight website or the official Midnight Twitter account, right? The Midnight website, I forget the exact URL, but it was kind of a little bit off from what they do. Is they just obfuscated a little bit to make it look like the main website, the official website. And then what they did with the Twitter account too is, they just created a Midnight Twitter account that kind of looked like the other one. Other things I've seen happen too, with Eternal is one of them, right? They're Eternal with the lowercase L on Twitter, Eternal Wallet. What they did was they took the L, the capital I, and just made a lowercase L and created a new Twitter account, matched their background image, put out some tweets and things like that. And they said, hey, there's a new beta.eternal.io website. Go to that. So you go to that, and now what if there's a malicious script on there that auto executes and you're not familiar with, you don't know what's happening, and then all of a sudden they have access to your system, they have access to your wallet, whatever, right? So what they're doing is, that's really all bad actors do. They try to slightly obfuscate the real thing. That's almost 90% of the time, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to trick you to click on a link. Are trying to obfuscate the main official thing to deceive you, to get you to quickly react. That leads me into my next point. Now, this might not be a glamorous answer or anything like that, but I was asked the other day, what is the number one mistake people make? And really, if you sum it up, the number one mistake that people make is reacting before thinking, right? So I get something sent to me without even thinking, I'd click on it, right? It's just my natural reaction to click on it. Then by the time you click on that link, it's probably already too late, right? There's a thing I tell people a lot where I would rather miss 9 out of every 10 good opportunities instead of getting compromised that 1 out of 100 times. It only takes that 1 out of 100 times to wipe everything out, right? So, if somebody asks me what's the best thing they can do to secure themselves, don't click on anything, right? Just don't click on anything. If you're not sure about it, don't do it, right? Think about when we were all kids. I'm 39. I think about when you were younger, and so people coming to door to solicit things was a very common thing. You didn't just let them in your house. You didn't just accept their offer. Like, no, stop telling me about it. Just give me the offer, right? That was never a thing, right? So why should that be a thing now, digital, right? Yeah. Let's see. So that's it. Does anybody have any other topics you want to go into, or any questions on that? If not, I'll go into some other things.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. I think my internet is sort of acting up. I left.
Okay.
So my question initially, just remember the follow-up question I had, sort of a technical question. You mentioned error handling regarding API security, and from a developer's perspective, because I'm currently learning at Imago, Haskell, and Plutus, and then we were taking through error handling concepts fundamentally using Haskell. So my question is, how exactly is errors handled in the context of API, using the term error handling, and from the technical approach? I don't know.
Now I'll give you, I'm familiar enough to give you an answer to that, but I have to admit, I'm not a developer. I can write some Python and stuff, right? But I tried to do the Haskell course and stuff, and it was just really over my head. So I'm not a developer. So honestly, the knowledge that I have along with the developer would be better served. And I'll probably do something like that sometime soon once I get a developer that wants to work with me on that. But really simply putting a good short answer to that, really, to start off with, is error handling in terms of API is that input validation, right? Verifying that the input, validating that input is what you're expecting to get, right? And if not, rejecting that, erroring it out, right? That's probably the number one thing you can do in terms of API error handling is, like I said, the validation input, verifying that, if I'm using a SQL query, ensuring that, there's, or maybe, I guess, like I said earlier on the call, an example would be if I'm expecting a user name password input, or if I'm expecting an input to list of systems or something, but I get something completely different than just, that's not what we were expecting. So,
okay. That makes sense. I understand your explanation. So
I think Haskell is
thing-
different though, right? Like if you're talking about error handling at Haskell, and you probably know more about Haskell than I do, right? But the way that those functions are built, I think that's a pretty difficult thing to do, isn't it? Well, maybe not for APIs. That's
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
talking API, right? But
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, well, from the Haskell perspective, right, or programming in general, error handling is they're just measures put in place to ensure that your system doesn't crash while executing a specific task, right? So if you say write a function that does something, but then there is a condition where based on a particular what's the word, say in a particular, you're expecting a given a deterministic result, but then there's a particular situation where you wouldn't get that expected result. You then need to put it in your code that, okay, this is what I'm expecting, but if that fails, then do this instead. You know, it's
Yeah.
sort of
it's like an if else
an
statement,
alternative.
right? If you get
Yeah,
this,
so-
go ahead. Else
do something
Fail.
else.
Yeah.
Do something else. Probably through an error, which is a string or something. Just do something else.
Mhm.
So it's sort of a safety. It's like a fail safe. That's basically what error handling is from a high level explanation. So I was just trying
Yeah.
to bring that into the context of APIs and how that's handled. So is error handling done? Is it a responsibility of the user to handle that? I'm trying to understand.
No,
is
that's
it who is
100%.
making the
That's the
API call?
developer. Right.
Okay, that's the developer. Okay, the person utilizing the API, right?
Well, it's the API developer, right? Whoever's creating that API, they're responsible for managing that error handling, right?
Okay.
You as a consumer of the API, you know, you're definitely not responsible for that, right? Yeah, I mean, the thing you have to
Okay.
be responsible for is if you have a private and public key for accessing that API, you know, you have to ensure that you're safely handling that, right?
Okay.
I would say
Okay.
that.
Okay.
Kyle,
Yeah.
I gotta go jump in another
thank you.
group
Thanks,
just
Jenny.
to say hi. But
I
I'll
All right,
see
appreciate
you.
Jenny.
Thanks for this. Bye.
Thank you. So did someone have something?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
so I think that the error messages also have other problems. So one thing is that if you don't validate something, the program may go off track, like with
Okay.
SQL injection, and be hacked because error is hidden, is not leading to a crash, right? And the second thing is that a crash with a bad error message may be misinterpreted and lead to misconfiguration or avalanche of other crashes that are unrelated to the error and will be misunderstood.
Okay.
right. That's a fair
So
point.
there are many things about error handling that may, even if error doesn't directly lead to insecurity, the problems with misconfiguration may, right? So there are indirect causes of bad error handling.
Right.
Okay. I'd actually love a lot more insight on that, but that would take us a little bit out of topic. So let's
I'm
stay
glad
with question.
to. I tell you what, if you two want to reach out to me, like I said, you can. My Twitter account is Holy Macaroni. That it ends in 2 E's and not an I.
Okay.
Or you can go to my Twitter account that I use for my project is epochsec_IO.
Okay.
You can go to either one of
Please,
those.
add it to the chat.
Yeah, I'll
Because
do that.
it's easier for
Sure.
me to make sure that I correctly copied it.
I don't know how to add it to just the chat here, but I'll just add it into the chat. And yeah, so it's just my my two handles I'm typing out are right here. epop_sec_io. So I just typed them in the main chat there. Yeah, there you go. So you all can send me a message on there that we can maybe figure out something. If maybe you want to have a deeper discussion on this, I would love that. That would be wonderful, because what I've also done, I have my documentation on my website. I do Twitter spaces. I do individual and team meetings, but I also started my YouTube channel a couple of weeks ago just to give everybody another format for whatever kind of way you like to ingest this knowledge. So if you want to do something like that and talk about the API subject specifically, that would be a wonderful thing to do. I'd be happy to do that if you want to. Thanks, Lee.
Sure.
I see you have to go. I appreciate you being here, Lee. But yeah, and since we're on the subject, let's just continue with it for a moment. So there are some other things you could do. So I mentioned rate limiting, right? And then you can also do performance testing. I'm not much of a developer, so really I just advise developers to do performance testing. But so I don't know the exact, I can't tell you to do these exact things, but really you're kind of load and stress testing the API, seeing how much it can handle, right? So that kind of comes wrong with so that might tell you how much you need a rate limit too, right? There are you could do penetration testing or vulnerability scans. There are a lot of things out there around that. You can, if you're a developer, you should go check out OWASP or OWASP top 10 API security list. So OWASP is a industry-wide thing where they put out a list of top 10 security vulnerabilities, and they have an API security list on there. You should go check that out. There are a lot of free tools out there. There's one called OpenVAS. So OpenVAS, that's an open source vulnerability scanner. That really came from something called Nessus, which is a security vendor in the security space, right? And they have you could buy their vulnerability scanner appliances, right? But the OpenVAS technology came from them. Was people have open sourced it, so you could do things like that. You can use Kali Linux, of course, as well to do different different tests. Let's see. Obviously, testing for SQL injections, right? You don't want people to inject a SQL map or anything like that into your API, right? I'm just kind of looking through the list because I didn't have anything else specific to mention, but I'm just kind of looking through here and seeing what else I might be able to mention. Yeah, that. There's also a thing out there. You can look up different API security checklists, right? But I would kind of have one of those handy if you're building an API. You obviously want to enforce TLS, right? I think TLS 1.2, maybe 1.3 is out. I don't know if it's an industry standard yet. I doubt it. But at least you should be using a minimum of TLS 1.2. We talked about basic authentication, right? Avoiding basic authentication using different authentication methods. I talked about that, I think, at the very beginning of the recording. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good list. There are other things, but I think those are probably the highlights. And then I kind of got off track on the other subject I was talking about around general security practices. Let's see here if I can get back to my other screen here. So I talked about, what you could do about, in terms of protecting yourself when accessing websites. Now I'll mention some websites and some tools you can use as an average user as well to better improve yourself. Password management, right? I think everybody's probably familiar with the LastPass hack recently in the last month or two. So password management is a great thing, but just like with anything, you need to be careful, right? I'm not going, if there are 3 different car vendors out there and one car vendor just sells cars that explode every month all the time, I'm probably not going to use them. Or if there's 3 different banks I want to go to and one is always in the news about something bad happening, then I'm probably not going to use them, right? Just do your research before you use something. But you could do self-posted password management as well, though. So I think Bitwarden has self-hosting password management, so you host all of the information yourself. See, the problem was with LastPass. There are a lot of problems with that situation with LastPass, right? But they mentioned eventually that the security vaults or the user vaults were compromised and accessed by the bad actor, right? And they're typically encrypted with your master password, which should be complicated. But if your master password isn't that complicated and they could essentially brute force it, there are mathematical computations that go into that, and they become more expensive the more they try to brute force it. So the more complicated it was, the better protected you probably are, right? But still, you should change all of your passwords in that. Well, I'm not going to get in that situation anymore. But the thing I want to mention, I never heard a lot of people talk about, is LastPass didn't necessarily encrypt everything, and not everything was necessarily in that vault right behind that master password. Another situation that occurred was your URL history was basically plain text or in hexadecimal, right? Easily converted to plain text, which in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you have to be concerned about what websites you're doing with your information. So there's usually, your password and username and password might show, the URL might show up as http:/username:password, and then your information would be there, right? So if they're practicing if the website's practicing bad behavior there, then your information could be compromised through that LastPass week, right? The other situation is if the website isn't practicing routine. I'm brain farting. I'm forgetting the term right now, but there are tokens on there, reset tokens, right? That they should be resetting periodically, like once a day, right? But what if they aren't resetting it that frequently? Then that information could still be there and that could be compromised, right? So the fact that your URLs were out there in hexadecimal was an issue not really mentioned a lot about, right? But anyway, I got off track there. I would just mention use self-hosting, right? Like I said, Bitwarden, but there are other options out there. Just do your research and find out self-hosting options and pick one, right? Another self-hosting option is physical security, right? Write down your information and lock it in your safe, right? I have a safe in my office right next to my desk where I keep stuff like that. That's another way to do it, right? Then you have multi-factor authentication. 2-factor authentication is a wonderful thing. I use the Google Authenticator for quite a few things, right? For example, but there's another thing that Lathisen actually brought up to me a while back ago, and I never thought about really telling people about it, but there's another potential vulnerability with 2-factor authentication. If you're receiving SMSs with the code, right? So if you have it set up to where if you log into a website, it sends you a text message with the code. Well, what if a bad actor SIM swaps you, right? So basically what that SIM swapping is if they call your service provider and they socially engineer your service provider into sending them a SIM card that will essentially, they put it in their phone and then they start receiving all your SMS messages and such, right? But you can just go, if you're using an Android, I don't have an iPhone, I'm sure it's in there, but on a Android at least, you can go into your settings, go into security, and then there's an option in there to enable SIM locking, right? To where then you'll have to authenticate in a new SIM, so you protect yourself that way. So SIM locking along with 2-factor authentication is great. I put out a YouTube video on there the other day. If you guys don't mind me entertaining you if you don't mind entertaining me, I'd really appreciate it. I'm going to write this in there. Hey, Thorsten, I didn't see you join, man. Nice to see you.
Yeah, I did. I thought this was the most interesting breakout room of all of them.
Well, I really appreciate that. I'm always thinking like, wow, those are probably way more entertaining. So I put got for Joel and Michael in there, Thorsten too, man. My YouTube site. Thorsten, you probably know about that because I have to report to you.
Yeah, I haven't looked at the report yet, but yeah.
Okay. But yeah, so if you go there, I put out a video the other day about user management. So there's a thing out there that you as a
sorry,
home user-
sorry, Kyle. Sorry to interject. Sorry. I
No
have
problem.
to go now.
Okay.
I have to leave now. I would wish I could stay longer because this
No problem.
is
Reach
quite
out to me and
interesting.
we can talk more about things, or
Yeah,
you
sure.
know, if you have some idea you want to do something together, let me know.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. Michael, nice to meet you. Thorsten, hello, sir. Nice to
Hello.
meet you, sir. Okay, I have to go now. See you
Yep.
guys later.
Have a good
bye.
one.
You too.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you.
So Thorsten, if you weren't here, I don't think you were here in the beginning, but I actually talked about more entertaining things in the beginning around API security, because there was a NFT project out there with staking mechanisms on their site where they thought they had a Franken address problem, but then they found out they had an API security issue. So that,
I
you
mean,
know,
the API topic is one which kind of will creep up on us quite quickly, because we are kind of starting to getting more and more sophisticated when it comes to user authentication. As you mentioned, kind of like a lot of sites, well, should you, let me put it this way, they give you the option and you should actually use it. So and I agree with you, kind of SMS or text messages are not necessarily per se perceived as safe anymore. Still, a lot of people use that. Even Emerson, for example, is using that, and there is a certain level of risk around it. But the main challenge probably for them is educate effectively the masses to use an authenticator which they didn't develop themselves, and they don't necessarily want to push them to the one or the other. So that's the reason why they're still using this technology.
yeah.
There is this element of convenience, and I always swear when I have to log into my Zoom account and have to kind of get my authenticator out to get effectively the authentication for it. But yeah, if you have the ability to switch on authentication with authenticator, that's probably at the moment the tool of choice.
YubiKey.
YubiKey, yes, but again, then cool. But again, that's a hardware solution.
Yeah.
On the let's say Cardano side, I can just strongly recommend. I mean, there are two things on that side. Don't just use effectively a web wallet with a password. Put effectively your stuff into a hardware wallet. Pick one, doesn't really matter, and disconnect the hardware wallet when you don't want to transact anything, because in that case no one can actually get to your seed phrase. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, this is an educational topic, and it's kind of like, unfortunately, the mistrust which we kind of see in the world is leading to the fact that the convenience has to suffer a little bit.
Yeah.
So people will exploit anything which they kind of, I mean, I'm kind of a hacker by heart. I try to break systems. Yeah, it's fun to break systems. Once you figure out how to break systems, it becomes, I'm not saying that I'm a bad actor, but it becomes very tempting in that context, and people do it for money. It's a big business. It's more lucrative to do cybercrime than to sell drugs, be in human trafficking, sex trafficking, and dealing with weapons together. So you make more money doing in comparison on that side than these three together. And I mean, we thought that drug trafficking is a problem. Probably it still is, at least as far as I see. But cybercrime is kind of the more lucrative, cleaner crime, and with the political situation which we are facing, it has even a political component. So
Yeah, it's
And the
just
other-
so easy.
it's just, and I mean, if you're sitting in a country where the state officially says, yeah, we will kind of like do something against it, but on the other side indirectly is propagating it, no chance. Yeah, kind of if you're living in North Korea or in Russia, you're
Mhm.
pretty much kind of like, as long as you hand over a favor sometimes to the government, and it's the same as China, you're safe, and you can pretty much do what you want. So it's kind of like, it's even less risk than doing anything else, and it makes money.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so
Yeah,
I mean,
and it's just so easy because, and the reason I say that is because of all the options out there. We call them script kiddies, right? If anybody's familiar with that term, a script kiddie is essentially that someone goes on a tour or goes on a dark web website. They pay for someone that's already created whatever malware they're looking for, and then all they have to do is run it, right? There's botnet services out there, BYOB, right? Build your own botnet
And-
services where you just say what you want and it builds you a distributed botnet service, right? So it's just so easy now to.
and it's highly professionalized. It's like as a service, the same way you can spin up a server in the cloud. You can spin up a ransomware attack effectively as a ransomware as a service, with people kind of providing effectively everything, and all you have to do is pay for it, and it's still profitable. So that is something we just have to be aware of. So kind of like put your cryptos in your own wallet. Don't trust any centralized exchanges or whatever. We've seen that. I mean, the last wake up call was FTX. A lot of people burned effectively their fingers on it. If you have crypto and you don't manage it yourself, be aware that sooner or later you might be victim to someone taking it away.
Yeah, and to that point, right? And kind of taking a point I mentioned way earlier about we're really still in the Web2 world. You're still using websites. They're still building websites like normal. Where, yeah, sure, if you're on a decentralized exchange and you're making a crypto transaction, then your fund, your transaction is on the blockchain, right? But everything else you're doing is still interacting with the website. So it's possible that DEX is just like any other website application gets compromised, right? Through Cobalt Strike or Mimikatz if they're hosting credentials for people, or the internal credentials or ransomware. I mean, all of these are still, all the traditional attacks we're used to are still possible there, right? They're not going to affect the blockchain, right? But they could still affect you and that team in other ways, right?
And I mean, come back to this API topic,
Mhm.
and that's effectively Web2. While on the user side, we're starting to get more security on the API side. Is Kyle?
I'm here.
Okay, so and just hey, don't put enough safeguardings in, and everything which works effectively on the user side in a similar way gets exploited also on the API side. Yeah, so
Yeah, you're right. That's a good point too about how, the API is just Web2 stuff. I hate using Web2, Web3, but it's what everybody's used to, right? But so I have to use it. But yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. I turned off my video because I'm not sure if I was having a latency issue or not. I'm running several nodes in my house for other purposes, so I turn them off to make sure it's not.
no problem.
But yeah,
Okay,
yeah. And there's a lot of tools out there too. And another thing I wanted to mention, I'll just read off the list really quick before I finish, because I think I'm almost at an hour. I'm not really sure how long you're supposed to do a breakout session, but
it's about an hour, kind of like, depending. Yeah.
but
At a
as
certain
it,
moment in time, they kick you out when they more or less get bored. And
okay. But some sites out there I mentioned to people that can help you in the quest of being away from the API topic and the technical topic for a moment, as an average user, things you can do to help protect yourself, right? You can, a lot of the things we've already talked about around, not keeping things connected to a website, things like that. But there's websites out there to help you too. You can take a website, you can take a file, things like that. You can go to something called VirusTotal, and you can put that in, and it'll run against security vendors, or if you put it in the file, or run against the file and let you know if it's potentially malicious or not. There are websites out there for training yourself, like StaySafeOnline.org, CISA, which is a U.S. government website. They have good information. ESET, ESET. You can also test your own skills. I'm actually building a server right now. There's an open source project called GoFish, and it's a way you can build phishing templates to test teams and stuff. So I mean, you can look at that if you're running a team. You could go to SANS.org if you're looking for really in-depth security awareness training. You could go to something called haveibeenpawned.com without the A, so it's PWNED. So haveibeenpawned.com. You can put your phone number, email address, and see if it's if it's been compromised or if it's sitting there exposed in the dark web or not. If you're checking sites, you can also go to something called transparency.google.com. So they have a site checker. Everybody has a Google account, right? And you don't think about this a lot, but there's a tool that Google has called, if you go to myaccount.google.com/security-checkup, it'll actually let you know a bunch of different things about your passwords and actions you might need to take and other things. Yeah.
I think we lost him now.
I should still be here. Hello? Hello? I look like I'm still here. Okay. Michael, are you here? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so maybe Thorsten's having a problem, do you think?
Yeah, it looks like.
Okay. Okay, well then I'll just kind of close up then, because I think it's kind of time now. So I mentioned the security checkup on Google. So if you also if you come across something that might be malicious, you can go to something called Abuse IP DB. So it's Abuse IP DB. They're a thing where you can report abusive websites or something that you think may be malicious. You could go to the registrar as well. So if you look up a website on like who.is or ican.org, sometimes it'll tell you the registrar where it's registered, and you could go to that registrar's website, right? So I think it was midnight when the bad actor created that fake midnight website. I looked that website up on ICANN and who.is. I found their registrar I think it was like API GmbH or something, but anyway, it was a European registrar. I was able to go to their website. They had a section in there where I could report a website, a domain that was hosted by them. And I think I mentioned that, and I think a handful of people did it, and they actually took that domain down pretty quickly. So you could do things like that. If you want to learn more technical things, there's a website out there called MX Toolbox. They show all kinds of things: DNS information, WHOIS reports, A records, SPF records, blacklisting, MX records. So if you want to get more in depth in website, email information, things like that, and understand what this kind of looks like, go play around with MX Toolbox. That's a pretty cool website. I think that is probably it. And just kind of, I mentioned this in the very beginning, so I'll go over the other things too. There are community tools out there, DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. There's a project out there called SCATDAO. I've actually talked to them a handful of times. Those guys are really good. They put out reports. They investigate different teams and projects out there and put out an in-depth report on them. There's a project out there called Zerberus that has project ratings. There's another project out there that does project ratings too. I'm forgetting their name right now. But, you know, if you're in the Cardano community somewhere, just ask people. Plenty of people know about these community services or tools that you can use to help you in your research. So just ask around about that. There's always new projects coming out, right? Yeah, so anyway, I think that about closes up. I think this has gone long enough. Thorsten, are you back?
I'm back. I just did a blip.
Oh, great, man. Great. Oh, I was just closing up a little tiny things. That was it. Do you got anything
No,
else to share? Because if not, I'll.
No, I think it's good for today, and
Cool.
there is more probably another day.
Awesome, man. Well, Thorsten, thanks for joining, and awesome to have you here. And Michael, I appreciate you listening in this whole time. I hope it was useful to you.
I was interested more about code reviews because
Okay.
there are few providers now. I think MLabs and Twig propose code reviews, and now Certic plans to do so.
Mhm.
But obviously, the things that can be easily spotted in the code reviews in Haskell are different than those in JavaScript, right? So we probably have less SQL injection. You just use the libraries that do not allow it, and less of overflow buffer type
Yeah.
of errors. So
That's kind of the idea around
What-
Haskell, right? Being functional programming, it kind of removes a lot of those types of security vulnerabilities, right?
yeah. So is there any static analyzer or guideline for the Web3 providers, software providers?
So I can't give you that direction on my own, right? Because I'm still kind of learning Haskell. But if you, Michael, if you look in the chat, you'll find my information, right? Send me a message later on and to remind me. And I have a list of different teams that I compiled that could help you with that kind of thing that you might want to reach out to for further information.
Cool. Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. Yeah, well, reach out to me and I'll help you out on the side. But otherwise, Michael and Thorsten, and if this recording goes up, everybody else have a great day.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.